Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this event. We're just going to give people a few more minutes to log in, and we'll be kicking off in a minute or so. So, good afternoon, everybody. I think it's now traditional that there's what I believe is called the Zoom 2-minute rule applies. So we assume that give people 2 minutes after the start time to join us. And so a very warm welcome to this event. We're delighted we've had over 300 registrations for this particular webinar from a range of organizations, which is very exciting to see, from very large multinationals through to those from the world of policy, through those to the world of academia, small companies, large companies. So a very warm welcome to everybody. My name is Tim Minshall. I'm the Dr. John C. Taylor Professor of Innovation at the University of Cambridge, and very pleased to see that Dr. Taylor is in the audience today, which is great. Welcome, Dr. Taylor. I'm also head of the Institute for Manufacturing at Cambridge, and we're delighted to be hosting this launch of the UK Innovation Report. And that's been brought together by a network under the name of the Cambridge Industrial Innovation Policy collaboration, which more on that later, that my colleague Dr. O'Sullivan will talk about. So if I may, could I ask for the agenda slide to be put up now, please? Just while we wait for that to happen, all I'm going to be doing is running through briefly that agenda. That's perfect, thank you very much. So when I've drawn my overview to an end, we're going to be handing over to Lord Sainsbury, who will give some initial reflections on the contents of this report, why it's been done, and what it could become as we take it forward to the next round of this. I'm then going to hand over to my colleagues, Dr. Eoin O'Sullivan and Dr. Carlos López-Gómez, where Eoin will talk first about setting the scene for this innovation report and highlighting the main themes to emerge from it. And then Dr. López-Gómez will talk specifically about more of the detail under each of those themes. And when that's finished, we're then going to switch to a different mode, which is to have a discussion about the findings of this report. So we're delighted that we have Ivana Dimitrova from BEIS with us, who will provide reflections from the perspective of BEIS on the contents of this report and the data within it and issues arising from that. And then it's great that we have Ben Fletcher, Executive Director of Policy and Engagement at Make UK, so representing the industry voice, the voice of UK industry, very relevant to this conversation, because this work is only being done if it is of use to policymakers and if it is helping UK industry do what it does even better. I'll be chairing that discussion, and we'll be ensuring that we draw in the questions that many of members of the audience have already provided. We've gone through these, filtered, grouped these together, but all the way through, you have the chance to submit further questions. And again, those questions will be reviewed by my colleagues in the background, who will be then making sure that I get to see them and then channel them to the right person or right people to address them. So that's all I was going to say by way of introduction, other than to repeat a very warm welcome to all of you. We really appreciate you being here and really look forward to addressing the questions in a moment. But now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Lord Sainsbury, as we have a very global audience with us today. He's a man who needs no introduction, but just to say, Lord Sainsbury is the former chair of Sainsbury's PLC, one of the largest supermarket chains in the UK and worldwide. Former Minister for Science for, I believe it was 8 years, and Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, and also a major philanthropist in a range of areas directly related to what we're seeing here. We'd also like to acknowledge a vote of thanks to him and the Gatsby Charitable Foundation for supporting the research and the publication of this report. So, Lord Sainsbury, could I hand over to you, please?
Jim, thank you very much. I should perhaps say, first of all, that it's one of the proudest things I did, that when I was made Minister of Science, I rechristened myself Minister of Science and Innovation, which I think is relevant to this discussion, because it seemed to me it was just as important to think about innovation for the economy as the science. As an introduction to this report, I'd like to say briefly why I think it's important. I think the first point to make is that economists in recent years have failed to agree as to why the UK has a slow rate of economic growth. It became very clear to me, however, when I was writing my book, Windows of Opportunity, How Nations Create Wealth, that the main reason why the UK's rate of growth in recent years was slow was that we had been losing competitive advantage and value added in high value added sectors of the economy, while at the same time we were creating lots of low value added service jobs. Now, as innovation is the source of competitive advantage and indeed production efficiency in both manufacturing and service sectors, this suggested to me that the reason why the UK has a slow rate of growth is that our rate of innovation is slower than competing economies, and that we should look more closely at our rate of innovation. And I therefore suggested that the Centre for Science, Technology and Innovation should research this issue further and produce an innovation report. This, I think they've done brilliantly, showing both how our growth performance has been affected by a loss of competitive advantage in key high value added sectors, and also how our performance compares with other countries. Also, the report shows very clearly where our industry needs to improve its performance, and I think where the government also needs to target its support. I should add that I think this last point about industry performance is very important. Reports such as this one are usually directed solely at governments, but I think this report also raises important questions for directors and chief executives of companies in some key sectors. It also, I think, provides a good starting point for the government as it seeks to enable the economy to recover from the impact of the pandemic and return to a period of steady economic growth. Finally, I'd like to congratulate Carlos López-Gómez and his team, who I think have done an excellent job in producing this report. And I'd now like to hand over to Eoin O'Sullivan to set the scene and highlight key messages in it.
Well, Sainsbury, thank you very much. And so we're now going to have two short presentations. First from Dr. Eoin O'Sullivan, Director of the Centre for Science, Technology and Innovation Policy, to provide the overview of the report. And then he will hand over to Dr. Carlos López-Gómez from the Policy Links Unit at the Institute for Manufacturing to talk through some of the details in a little more depth. Eoin, over to you first, please.
Thanks, Tim. So if everyone can hear me, as Tim said, I'm just going to quickly introduce the report and ourselves and highlight some key messages, and then hand over to Carlos for, frankly, a far more interesting presentation where he's going to illustrate the real richness of the data that his team has gathered and some of the insights they've gained and the kind of interesting questions they pose to policymakers, and as Lord Sainsbury said, to industry as well, which will hopefully stimulate a useful discussion and debate. We've called it an innovation report, but just to highlight at the beginning, this is fundamentally about trying to better understand the relationship between innovation and industrial performance, exploring why the details of particular sectors matter, why attention to trends in value added matter, and the implications for how we think about productivity and competitiveness, and maybe even the process of innovation itself. Next slide. You'll feel like Chris Whitty saying next slide. So just a brief word about our industrial innovation policy community. It's made up of a set of complementary activities in research and knowledge exchange and consulting and convening, with this common interest in innovation policy and industrial. I'm the Centre for Science, Technology, Innovation Policy, the academic research team, and Carlos is the head of the policy links team, the one that developed this report and pulled everything together. We're based at the Institute for Manufacturing, of which Tim Minshall is the director. This is the division of manufacturing and management. So we bring a very engineering, management, technologist, manufacturing perspective and insights to sort of key policy questions at the interface of technological innovation and industrial competitiveness, where the details of the technologies and industries matter. A lot of the academic research we do is focused on understanding how knowledge from the research and innovation base gets translated into technologies and industries and economic wealth. And so part of the motivation for this report came from our experience of exploring these sort of interactions between national research systems, innovation systems, and national value chain systems. And the data and evidence we need is scattered. It's distributed among different agencies and reports and databases, and it's not always compatible, and it's certainly not all in one place. And the policy evidence is often siloed into indicators related to innovation, often just R&D, and indicators related to industry, and reports by agencies with different missions, making it a lot harder perhaps than it should be to explore the relationship between innovation and industrial performance. I should say in a way that's maybe not necessarily the case in some other countries, where if you look at similar-ish national innovation reports, some countries are, in their discussions and analysis of innovation, paying more attention to the industrial details, the configuration of sectors, how value is distributed, how that's changing, and often presenting the mix of data in interesting and perhaps more illuminating ways. Next slide, please. So what makes this report different? I mean, we bring the policy links team brought together data and evidence from a range of disparate sources. It's not entirely novel. Others have gathered together similar sets of indicators. The Office for Life Sciences in BEIS has published for a number of years a set of competitiveness indicators, similar kinds of evidence, but maybe with slightly different questions. Previous incarnations of BEIS had a growth dashboard, which had similar information. And back when it was DTI and Lord Sainsbury was Minister for Science and Innovation, there was some excellent innovation reports. But there's no multi-sector report quite like it now, at a time when the UK government is aiming for a 2.4% GDP target for R&D investment, where there are still discussions about the productivity puzzle in the context of innovation policy, a time when post-Brexit global Britain plans to reach out to the rest of the world in trade deals and research innovation partnerships. So it is, we hope, a useful time to have competitor data related to innovation and industry collected and juxtaposed in a hopefully useful and accessible format. Again, a significant emphasis on understanding the relationship between innovation investment, and industrial performance, and hopefully in a way that makes it easier to compare and relate indicators and trends related to both innovation and competitiveness. I think it's important to highlight that we see this very much as a first report, first experiment in what you can see in the evidence if you bring together the different innovation sector performance together, data together in the same place. But it perhaps inevitably raises as many questions as it answers. And so the report, and I guess this event today, is as much about stimulating a conversation and starting a discussion and a debate about what evidence is really needed to understand the complex relationship between innovation and industrial performance, and how should we think about and understand productivity and competitiveness. And again, critically, what are the evidence gaps? What new data and indicators do we need for more effective industrial strategy, more effective innovation policy. Next slide. So what we've done, I mean, hopefully people will have seen the report. This is essentially the table of contents. We've gathered the data and the indicators and different representations of the evidence against policy themes and framed them in terms of particular policy questions. So we've looked at the context of the mix of different industrial activities in nations and how they're evolving, innovation-related trends within those different economies, the performance of particular sectors in terms of value added and employment and exports, as well as research and innovation, as well as the indicators related to the workforce that's involved in the developing, diffusing, and use of those innovations within those sectors. And hopefully it's done in a way that's concise and accessible so that we can facilitate discussions about innovation and industrial performance. And the juxtaposition and some of the analysis helps identify patterns in the data about the UK's relative performance that need to be understood, raises questions about what new evidence we need, as I said before, especially evidence related, again, not just to industrial strategy, but probably for trade deals, for inward investment strategies, even for any UK mission-oriented moonshot R&D endeavours or agencies, and the potential for the UK industrial base to capture direct economic value from the innovations and solutions developed. So hopefully it's useful for a range of purposes. Next slide. So Carlos will go into depth in many of the findings, but some of the individual headlines probably won't be a surprise to many in this audience. It's no surprise, I guess, that there has been a concern about UK labour productivity for some time. There's been debates about the productivity puzzle for the last 7-8 years. But the key message, I guess, is that looking at key individual sectors in detail and trying to untangle the trends in market prices from issues of production efficiency, you can start to diagnose the key contributing factors more clearly. So, for example, North Sea oil, a traditionally important part of the UK economy, the fall in productivity you can see is more to do with the fall in the price of oil, and maybe the increasing difficulty of extracting the remaining oil out of the North Sea. Declines in productivity not necessarily being an issue related to levels of automation or differences in workforce effort between the UK and competitor economies. And if we're going to see the effects of innovation in industrial performance, it's important we can strip out these other effects. Similarly, it'll be no surprise to most people in this audience about just how challenging the government's ambition to reach the total R&D investment target of 2.4% of GDP will be. It's going to need a real step change in investment. It's only risen a fraction of 1% in the last 20 years. Striking to me, at least, was the level of UK business enterprise R&D and the contribution to total UK R&D, relatively low in comparison to other countries. And it raises all sorts of interesting questions about how much this is to do with the nature of particular sectors versus the nature of industry in the UK, or the UK research and innovation system in particular technology domains. But for sure, reaching the 2.4% will require catalyzing more business R&D investment. So raises all sorts of questions about what's driving these national sectoral differences in business R&D. Certainly something that needs to be better understood. Next slide. So again, Carlos is going to go, I think in particular, into exploring some of the industrial performance data in particular sectors. So I'll just emphasize again that there are significant variations in trends between different sectors in different countries, striking variations by productivity and exports and R&D spending. Carlos will illustrate, I think, some of the really interesting patterns you can see for particular sectors and reflect on what's driving the apparent success of some countries in sectors that are important to the UK economy. In terms of workforce, again, the headline figures are probably not a surprise, but still very striking, the relative weighting towards employment of researchers, STEM researchers in HE, higher education and government by comparison to other countries, relatively low levels of higher technical education by comparison with many other leading economies, raising all sorts of important questions about the nature of the UK R&D technical workforce and the implications for the adoption and use of new innovations and the speed of adoption of new technological innovations. Next slide, please. So finally, again, Carlos will illustrate with real examples some of the evidence patterns we see and the questions they raise for policymakers. But again, I think some final key messages in terms of the approach is again the importance of sector level analysis, the need to diagnose underlying trends affecting national performance, but also it's useful in terms of identifying areas of comparative advantage and seeing signals of potential constraints to technology adoption. I think the other really striking thing, and certainly something I learned as the report was being developed, was just how important it was to get insights from industry and technological know-how to identify and interpret key sector trends, key patterns that Carlos and the team saw in the data. And we learned a lot from colleagues in Make UK, where Ben is from, and some of the analysis and reporting they've done in their sector bulletins and so on. So this is, I think, going forward, this will have to be done in partnership with industry if we're going to diagnose key competitiveness trends that really matter for industrial strategy. Finally, I suppose, again, we need, ultimately, this is about better understanding of the interdependencies between innovation and industrial performance. We're going to need a better understanding of productivity. I think that's a key message that's emerged from this report. But again, this is a first report. As I said, a first experiment in what you can see in the data if you bring different types of indicator together. And again, finally, it's about stimulating a conversation. What evidence do we need in the future? How do we understand productivity, competitiveness, innovation? What are the better indicators of the future? How can we do better innovation policy, better industrial strategy? Thank you. And I'll, I think, hand over directly to Carlos, where he'll illustrate some of those points with actual pretty pictures.
Thank you so much, Eoin. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carlos López-Gómez from the Policy Links Unit here at the Institute for Manufacturing. So I'm just going to put my slides up there. They are. So today, my job is really to provide a quick overview of some of the key graphs and figures in each of the 4 themes of the UK Innovation Report that have been introduced by Eoin. I would like to start by thanking my colleagues Jennifer Castañeda, Michele Palladino, David Leal, and Tong Yi-seong, who are the ones who put together this data. And to colleagues from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS, Make UK, and the Gatsby Charitable Foundation, who shared data and offered technical advice. As Eoin said, our intention is not to identify all the root causes that fully explain UK's economic performance, but to curate a selection of indicators that facilitate discussion on the relationship between industrial performance and innovation, and I'll try to do that now. So apologies in advance because I'll try to cover a lot of ground in a short period of time. So first off, theme 1, structure of the UK economy. This theme addresses the questions, how has the structure of the UK economy changed over the last few years, and how are these changes affecting economic performance? We'll start with labor productivity, which is widely portrayed as a critical gauge of an economy's long-term potential. So contrary to other advanced economies, the UK was unable to return to the productivity growth trends recorded before the 2007-2008 financial crisis. So in 2018, the UK's labor productivity measured by GDP per hour worked, the graph that we have here, was barely above its 2007 level. So you'll see here basically a flat line in the UK performance over the last decade. Roughly, UK productivity is lower than that of the US and Germany by 20 and 30% respectively, but above that of Japan and Korea, but around similar margins. The lack of agreement among analysts regarding the reasons behind this relatively poor performance of UK economy has been dubbed the UK productivity puzzle. So the analysis presented in this table reveals key sectoral trends behind the relatively slow rates of productivity growth in the UK. Notably, the UK has seen an increase in the relative contribution of sectors with low value added per hour worked and a reduction in the share of high value added sectors. This table shows broad sectors of the UK economy arranged according to their value added per hour, which is a typical measure of labor productivity. So what we see here is this line here, we have a range according to their value added per hour. So you have the category other services at the bottom, which includes retail, hospitality, and administrative services, is the one with the lowest value added per hour. And there are different measures and these different proxies for measuring these different ways in which we measure this, but the results are similar with different types of value-added measures. And here we see medium and high-tech manufacturing, which includes pharma, aerospace, and automotive, being the one with the highest value added per hour. So worryingly, what we see, and Lord Sainsbury has mentioned this already, is that low value adding services have actually increased their share in the UK economy, and we see in this column here, from 50.3% to 52.1% in 2018 and 17, sorry, so the last 10 years. And meanwhile, the medium to high-tech manufacturing, as well as other production, which includes oil and gas, have seen their share in the economy reduce. So we are seeing again this issue of low value-adding activities increasing their share in the UK economy, high value-adding activities decreasing its share in the economy. And in the report, we present more disaggregated figures. Within knowledge services, for example, financials and insurance activities show the highest value added per hour. However, their share in UK value added has dropped significantly from 8% to 7% in 2017. So the contribution to the UK economy has been reduced. And the same we observe for extraction of crude, petroleum, and natural gas within other production. It also reports the highest value added per hour across the whole economy, but its contribution has declined by 60% over the last 10 years, reflecting the decline of UK oil and gas production, as well as drops in international prices. So of course, these two examples have nothing to do, or the performance of those two sectors have nothing to do with what we often think of when we talk about productivity in terms of efficiency. These are just two examples. So a key point to make here is that trends in key sectors of the UK economy and the reasons why they occur are too often overlooked, but are essential to gaining a better understanding of the UK's economic performance. Theme 2 addresses the question of whether UK government and the private sector are spending enough on R&D compared to other countries. The UK ranks below key comparator countries, as we see in this graph, in terms such as Japan, Germany, the US, in terms of what it spends on R&D as percentage of GDP. So we see here that the UK is below the OECD average. Now, the UK government has committed to boosting investment in R&D to 2.4% of GDP by 2027. However, as Eoin mentioned, achieving this goal would require a step change in recent trends. This is because this figure has only increased from 1.6% to 1.7% between 2000 and 2018. So basically it has remained almost constant in the last 20 years. And as Eoin mentioned as well, the business sector contributes less to the funding of R&D in the UK than in other countries such as Germany, Korea, and Japan. Manufacturing industries remain the largest contributors to R&D expenditure across industrialized economies, despite the sector's relatively decline as a share of the economy in most industrialized countries in the last couple of decades. So it is difficult to measure R&D across the economy, especially in services. But what we observe in the UK figures is that in 2018, the pharmaceutical industry, automotive, and aerospace accounted for around 40% of total business R&D expenditure in the UK. And this suggests, obviously, that manufacturing industries have a key role to play in achieving the UK's 2.4% target. We have more disaggregated data as well in the report. One topic that we cover is venture capital, which was of interest to a number of our stakeholders. Just to mention that the UK venture capital is relatively concentrated, obviously in London, but also in two key sectors, ICT and biotech. As we can see in this graph, you can see the top two categories here in this graph are the ones that are concentrated most of the investment. So a key question here is how venture capital can reach a broader set of industries and support and leverage R&D investments in the private sector and also in the public sector. The third section of the report, industrial performance, explore how are UK industries performing in terms of productivity, value added, and employment. and whether they are investing enough in R&D compared to international peers. So this figure demonstrates the relationship between value-added, employment, and productivity. So the horizontal axis here measures the change in employment, so fewer jobs to more jobs. And the vertical axis measures the change in value added during the period of analysis. So what it allows us to do is to have a more detailed country and sector comparison than by only considering overall productivity growth figures, by explicitly showing us how productivity grows or declines. So let me illustrate in the next graph. So this chart compares the UK's pharmaceutical industry with that of other countries. So we have a number of industries and that we have analyzed in detail in the report, and I'm just going to show a couple of them for illustration. So pharma contributed to around 7.5% of manufacturing gross value added in the UK in 2018, so it's an important industry. The chart shows that productivity growth collapsed in pharmaceuticals as value added contracted at a quicker rate than that of employment. So we see in this graph that because the UK has reduced its value added, the growth of value added, but also the growth of employment, it's in the negative productivity growth zone. If we compare that with other countries, we have, for example, the cases of Switzerland, where value added has accelerated, growth has accelerated as well as employment. And therefore they're in the positive productivity growth zone. You have countries like Singapore, for example. So according to these figures, employment has grown, but value added hasn't grown at the same pace. And therefore it's also in the negative productivity growth. So a couple of points here is that this analysis help us understand not only the high level figure on productivity, but also whether employment is changing. Are we hiring more people? Is this industry gaining market share in the world? Because we see the growth of value added compared to other countries. And you can see, for example, in the case of Singapore, you have negative productivity growth, but then you have employment growth as well. So obviously you have different implications for policy, whereas whether you are in the area of the UK or whether you are in the area of Singapore, and of course the area of Switzerland as well. So, and then we compare this to other variables. So the UK has suffered from a rapid loss in trade competitiveness in pharmaceutical products from the standpoint of trade balance. In 2009, the UK was the 5th largest net exporter of pharmaceutical products with a surplus of around $10 billion. However, since 2014, the UK has recorded trade deficits in pharmaceutical products in almost all years. And the deficit has widened to around $125 billion in 2019, placing it among the 3rd quartile of countries according to trade balance. The widened deficits were a combination of a dip in exports between 2009 and 2018, and an increase in imports as well. In 2018, the pharmaceutical industry accounted for almost 18% of overall business R&D expenditure in the UK. But the sector spent 3% less in 2018 than it did in 2008. So obviously, as we can see in this graph, the UK has reduced in terms of the compound annual growth rates, its R&D investment when compared with other countries. Obviously, you can see the effect of this reduction of investment here in the graph. Obviously, we haven't, the impact of COVID-19 is not yet reflected here. And probably that also tells you that by the time we get these figures, it's probably too late already. So that's again emphasizing the point that Eoin made about understanding industry trends in communication with industry and industry associations, as we don't get these figures fast enough. So obviously, research and development is fundamental to pharmaceutical industries that rely on the discovery of new drugs and to achieve growth. So we move to another industry here. So this graph compares the aerospace industry. The UK ranks in 4th position in the world in the manufacturing of air and spacecraft and related machinery in value-added terms. The UK has become, and as we can see in this graph, productivity growth in the UK has been positive, and employment has been growing as well as value-added. So you have all these countries in the positive productivity growth. However, this graph also shows that value-added growth has been larger in countries like Germany, and France, unemployment has been growing more rapidly in countries like Canada and Italy. So even despite this positive headline figure, what this allows you to do is to have this international comparative perspective. And the result, as we see in the figures, is that the market share of the UK has actually been reduced over the last few years. So again, a lot of more detail about these figures in the report. In terms of trade, the UK has become increasingly competitive in aerospace products from the perspective of trade balance. Its position improved from being the 23rd largest net exporter in 2009 to the 4th largest in 2019, with the surplus widening to around $8 billion in 2018. Again, the effect of COVID-19 is not yet reflected as it will be felt across this sector and the whole economy. In terms of R&D, in 2018, the aerospace industry accounted for 6.8% of overall business R&D in the UK. It is the 4th largest contributor to business R&D after pharma, automotive, and computer programming. And it has grown, as we can see in this graph, by 3.9% between 2009 and 2016, outpacing growth rates in countries like Italy and France, and basically every other country that we see in this graph here. So you have the two cases of industries that are behaving differently. And when we observe that the behavior of value added is different as well, we see some behaviors in terms of R&D expenditure and innovation activity that also shows big differences between these industries. So finally, theme 4 looks at science and engineering workforce. Undergraduate enrollment in science, technology, engineering, and math disciplines has increased steadily in the UK in recent years. In 2018, graduates in STEM disciplines accounted for around 44% of total graduates in the UK, above comparators in countries such as France, the United States, and Canada. So it has grown steadily over the last few years, and when looking at other countries, the UK is in a better position in that count. According to UNESCO, only around 30% of the world researchers are women, despite the fact that in recent decades, the number of women enrolling in tertiary education has increased. In the UK, the share of women researchers is above the world average, and well above countries like Japan, Korea, and Germany, as we can see in this graph. Recent analysis have argued that the UK tertiary education, the education system overall, actually, is marked by a missing middle of higher technical education, which is post-secondary education, as well as short cycle tertiary education. So for example, in 2018, students who enrolled in short cycle tertiary educations in the UK made up 12% of total tertiary education, as we see in this graph, compared to 36% in the United States and 22% for Canada and Korea. So the lack of higher technical education skills may have implications for the competitiveness of the economy, as the job market requires a variety of skills that are not always provided by standard 3-year bachelor degrees. So that was my last slide. Again, apologies for trying to cover so much ground in such a short period of time. For more details, we obviously encourage you to take a look at the innovation report, and the technical details of the indicators for those interested in the technical part of it are also described there. Do please get in touch. We will really value your comments, your feedback, in order to shape the next version of this report in the following years. So now over to Tim.
Carlos, thank you very much. And Eoin, thank you very much for setting the scene there as well. A really rich picture, a fantastic job at bringing together all of this data and putting it into a format that's really useful and inaccessible. But as we stressed at the beginning, and has been highlighted by Eoin, this is the beginning of a conversation. We want to say, well, that's great, but what does this really tell us and what more is needed? So if I may, I'm going to hand over now to Ivana Dimitrova from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy to give her reflections on what is in the report and what's just been presented by Eoin and Carlos. Ivana, over to you, please.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Eoin and Carlos, for an extremely illuminating presentation and report. I really welcome the report, and it has been extremely helpful to see the evidence base on innovation and industrial policy being put together in a one coherent narrative. And I think what I will do is just dwell a little bit on where I see the policy implications of some of the headline findings, and maybe stimulate a bit of the discussion later. But I think that the headline finding in itself is quite striking and immediately has policy implications. The fact that we have seen a structural shift in our economy away from high value added sectors towards low value added sectors. So if I maybe start with the low value added picture, what really struck me is the fact that these are sectors which are quite labor intensive and also less susceptible maybe to innovation, which could actually also have insights into their productivity performance. But what also struck me is the link to COVID-19 and the fact that these sectors such as retail, hospitality, are also the ones which are actually most impacted by COVID, and the labor force is impacted by COVID. And I think the policy challenge here, to use a government term, is how do we build back better? How do we improve the productivity performance in those labor intensive sectors? And that is a policy challenge that I will take away and incorporate in our thinking. The challenge on high valued sectors, and Eoin did allude to this, is more around how do we capture the value of innovation generated within those sectors, both domestically and internationally. And there, the story, the report actually does complete a lot of the story around exports and the workforce, because it's not enough to be innovative and to produce world-leading research. It's how do you actually harness this research to improve productivity performance across business? How do you improve productivity performance across regions? And how do you capture the value of that innovation in your exports? And I think that the findings around workforce, human capital, and exports are really, really welcome and really reinforce the story about we need to do a bit more in capturing the value of innovation, both in terms of our exports and workforce. Where I think we could go further and maybe next steps, the regional picture is extremely important, and how do we actually harness the value of innovation in regions? And manufacturing really does play a big role. There is this phrase of the manufacturing commons, and how do you actually embed innovation in regional innovation systems? And that would be a really, really fascinating angle to explore in the next iterations of the report. And the final thing is, how do you capture the value of innovation within firms? And this is where I would welcome the discussion and insights from business in particular. A key finding from your report is that businesses are not reinvesting enough into R&D. What is the driving force of this? Do businesses have the capability to do this? That is something really, really, that is an area I would really, really welcome further research on. And in particular, how does COVID-19 again influence the firm's ability to capture innovation? Because we know that a lot of firms will be emerging out of COVID with much diminished financial resilience, and I would welcome business views on that. So I will. This is the short introduction. I will leave a little bit of room for discussion, but also happy to take any questions.
Ivana, that's brilliant, really helpful. Thank you for that. And also a very neat segue into comments from Ben Fletcher from Make UK. Ben, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Tim. And thank you to the presenters who've gone before me. It's an excellent summary of what is an outstanding report. And we were delighted to be asked to contribute today, and very, very grateful for the rigor that has gone into this. It's hugely valuable. I've got in front of me a page of speaking notes that I and my team worked up ahead of this. And I'm going to be slightly brave, or arguably slightly stupid, by departing from them a little bit, because I think what we've heard is a fantastic summary of what the state of the economy is and industry is like at the moment, and from my perspective, a manufacturing perspective, some really valuable insights that add further weight to things that we've already researched ourselves, or given us an external and even stronger validation of some of the conclusions we've reached. And I wanted to try and address a couple of the points that have come out, and maybe make me go off piste, maybe give you more of an emotional answer than a studiously prepared answer, but I hope that's valuable. Make UK represents a sector that is much bigger than people realise. Manufacturing is about 12% of the economy. It means it's bigger in its own right than financial services. It's bigger than construction. People think it's a sector of the economy that's in decline. In fact, it's in robust health. We're one of the 10 biggest manufacturing and exporting nations on earth. Almost 3 million people work in the sector, and we contribute almost half of the country's exports, which, given how strong we are in services, is a particularly proud moment. Given all of that strength, the kind of gaps in productivity, the gaps in investment and innovation are particularly stark. And I think one of the critical things where we want to use this report, work with the Institute, work with the stakeholders, and responding to Ivana, work with BEIS, is that what we really think we need, particularly given the challenges of the last 12 to 18 months, arguably the challenges of the last 4 years, dealing with COVID, and I'm sure we all today want to avoid a sojourn into Brexit, but certainly we can say, without opening up that can of worms, that we're dealing with one of the biggest changes to our trading relationships we've ever seen. And manufacturers, like I said, are very, very focused and reliant on the export market. We face a sort of almost unparalleled and unique challenge. And what's really critical here is to work with government on what is currently called an industrial strategy. I think the new Secretary of State for Business wants to think about these things in a different way. But what there needs to be is a collaboration and a partnership where we can work together to set out a path to address some of these problems collectively. I think certainly the member companies that we represent tell us that skills is an enormous challenge. We don't have enough of the medium, technical, and bordering into highly skilled people to drive that change within business. And firms are nervous about investment because they're not confident that they've got the skills base that's going to allow them to realise the benefits of that investment. There are lots of things around a national plan. Government, I don't think for a while, Lord Sainsbury is a very honourable and marked exception to this, but for a long time, government, I don't think, has always got manufacturing and the importance of manufacturing. It's difficult to persuade an SME somewhere a long, long way from a major city to invest in artificial intelligence and robotics if they can't actually currently use their mobile phone in their factory and they haven't got fibre broadband anywhere near them. And there is a real disjoint in these things and the acceleration and take-up of new technologies and the things that are going to help us tackle the productivity gap. And we can come on to this again later, but this isn't about picking winners and all of the things that people get concerned about with industrial strategies. It's also about marking the path to the future. We know that the future of manufacturing will be around net zero, the green economy, how Britain can be a world leader in these areas. We know, for example, that many of our firms in the aviation sector, because of the last 12 months, are absolutely on their knees at the moment because of a catastrophic decline in demand for that service and that sector. If we want the industry to adapt and grow to fulfill those jobs in the future, we need to keep those firms alive and we need to keep those skills alive. And one of the real values of this report is it allows us to go back to government to say, don't let these sectors wither on the vine, don't let the market just do its thing, because if we do, we'll lose the capability to regrow and rebuild and have that power and have that strength in those new and emerging sectors. Manufacturing, 12% of the economy, already provides over 50% of the R&D spend. So what we need to do, I think, is to further accelerate that, have a further structure around an industrial strategy and a relationship with Treasury that gives us some fiscal incentives for firms to do even more than that. But there needs to be a spine, there needs to be a backbone, there needs to be something that firms can build on. So a fantastic report, lots and lots of really positive things, but I think there are a number of challenges to overcome those barriers, and we will achieve them by working together we'll achieve them in partnership. And one of the most important things our member companies would say is that the future looks a bit scary at the moment. And actually the relationship between academia, science and research and helping firms avoid the snake oil salespeople and move into the capabilities that have value will be one of the really important things, and where the UK has a head start, we need to utilise it even more effectively. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you as well to Ivana, for both of you for kind of bringing together the key issues there from your perspectives, and also showing very, very clearly the linkages between what industry needs and the role that government can play. So we have a slight problem in that we've had rather a lot of questions coming in. So we had people submit questions in advance. We've had people submitting questions now. So it's up to me to try and filter through this. And but I think it's fair to say, with my limited chairing skills, we're not going to be able to get through all those questions. So we apologize in advance for that. The questions will all be captured. The questions, we will try and respond where we can to those and post responses to them as appropriate. But before going to the Q&A session, could I just loop back, if I may, to Lord Sainsbury for any comments you'd like to make specifically on how you see what's in this report being most critical for boosting the UK's economic growth?
Yeah, I think there's some very key messages, and we must be a bit careful about getting bogged down too much in detail and focus on these overall points because they are saying something rather different to what is normally said about economic growth. And I think one of the first points to make is just a technical one. When people talk about productivity, economists talk about productivity, people think that they're talking about production efficiency. And I think economists sometimes make that mistake themselves. They're of course not talking about production efficiency, they're talking about value added. And our growth figures depend on increasing the amount of value added produced by the economy. Going on from that, what these figures tell us is that value added per capita is hugely different in different sectors of the economy. And by and large, the knowledge intensive sectors of the economy have higher value added per capita. Going on from that, it tells us that our low rate of economic growth is due to the fact that we've been losing market share and competitive advantage in some of the high value added sectors, particularly high value added manufacturing. If we do that, and at the same time as doing that, we've created lots of low value added jobs in the service sectors. And the important thing to understand, and I think I've addressed this point particularly to Ivana, is those low value added service sectors will always be low value added. And they're low value added because it's very difficult to get competitive advantage in them. So we won't solve our problems by trying to increase the productivity of the low value added service sectors. What we have to do is create more high value added jobs and firms in the high-tech manufacturing area or in business services, because business services do have high value added because you can create competitive advantage. So this has a strong message, which is different from the economists, most economists. Most economists say we're becoming a service economy and don't fight it and don't worry about losing your manufacturing industry. And these figures say absolutely that is wrong. What they say is we have to increase our high value added manufacturing jobs if we want to have economic growth. And the high value added, of course, depends on being competitive advantage in the marketplace. So why does the iPhone make masses of money for Apple, it's not because it's more production efficiency. All the iPhones in the world appear to be made in China. The reason it makes a lot of added value for Apple is because it's got competitive advantage. People want to have their iPhone, Apple iPhone, and will pay a lot more for it. And that's what creates high value added. So if we want to increase our GDP, we have to increase our more knowledge intensive, high value added per capita firms and jobs. And that has a huge impact on what are the policies we need to follow. And those are things like government developing the generic technologies for these key areas. It's about knowledge transfer from universities. It's about diffusion of technology on things like Industry 4. I mean, at our current moment, our diffusion of technology for Industry 4 is pathetic. I mean, other countries have proper national programs and we haven't got one in place. And if we think we can have high value added industry jobs and not have diffusion of the Industry 4 technology, we're living in cloud cuckoo land. And we've also got to produce the new specialized skills for these new high technology jobs. So I think there's a very clear message here, and it's not the usual message. It's a message which looks at the figures and says, this is what we've got to do, and this is what we've got to do to get economic growth. And it's to change direction and get more high value added, knowledge intensive jobs, or we'll gradually continue to slide downwards. There's also, of course, a message for businesses here, which is they've got to increase their rate of innovation so they can compete with the South Koreas, the Taiwans, the Singapores of this world. Increase the rate of innovation. That's about having really good innovation strategies. It's about putting more money into R&D, almost certainly. It's one of the figures in this, which is, I think, very worrying, is our low rate of R&D is not only about government not putting in enough R&D, it's about businesses not putting in enough R&D. And until there are real changes that we've got to make here. So I'm afraid that's a bit of a rant, but these figures should produce a rant because we've got to get people focused on what are these real problems.
Lord Sainsbury, thank you very much. So it seems that there are two sets of ways we can take this conversation forward in the immediate future and in the longer term. One is about, are we capturing the right things and making them useful to the right people in the right way? And then there is what actions need to be taken as a result of having that. So perhaps if I could turn maybe to Ben first, just on this issue of picking up on something Lord Sainsbury said there about, and companies need to X, Y, and Z. Would you get a comment from the perspective of those you represent, please?
I will do my very best to follow that tour de force. I think that there's not a lack of appetite, and your report, this report, and our survey of our members and our engagement with members say some very consistent things. People expect the landscape to change. People expect the take up of I4 technologies and a range of other things to be massively expansive over the next few years. What we get more anecdotally is a nervousness from quite big, medium-sized employers about how do you achieve some of the things that Lord Sainsbury was talking about in terms of those high value add roles and those high value add industries. The challenge, I think, over the next few years is not about big firms. Big firms are actually in the UK often global leaders in some of this. They're very strong, they're very capable, they're often part of multinationals, they share their best practice around the world, and they learn from their partners and other competitors, as well as their own branches around the world. The big tail off, I think, anecdotally, is how do you get medium-sized and smaller-sized companies to be part of that shift and part of that change? And that is the nervousness that they have. Some of this goes back to the kind of things I was talking about earlier, the challenges around the technology capability, the challenges that if you look at our comparisons with South Korea, some of the other very, very fast improving countries, there is a real strength of global national networks, fiber broadband and so on, that build confidence. There are also, I think, schemes that are very successful here. We have a fantastic scheme called Made Smarter. It's been rolling out in the Northwest that is about taking the lessons of those excellent schemes that big firms have invested in and sharing them with SMEs, making them relevant to SMEs because they have to be described and demonstrated in a different way. There has finally been a commitment by government to expand that scheme around the country. But if you look in comparison to what other countries have done, we're several years behind. So those kind of things really need an enormous acceleration and enormous advancement if you want to move that strength from big firms all the way across the manufacturing sector. And I do think, and we do, those of you who've heard Make UK before, it's something that we do bang on about, but we're firm believers that people have only got the message when they're absolutely bored witless of hearing the line. But skills is an absolutely critical thing, and I think an area where we are at a disadvantage in comparison to some of our competitors. Even at the height of the Brexit challenge, skills was still the issue that our member companies said was the thing that worried them most, even when we had the peak of uncertainty around Brexit. At the moment, if you're trying to recruit a skilled technician, about a third of all vacancies go unfilled for over 3 months. And that is a very poor position to be in comparison to some of our competitor nations. And if firms are going to make those investments and have the confidence to move forward, there has to be the skills base that enables them to do so. And this isn't about actually the universities. The universities are very good at producing highly skilled graduates that come in and drive innovation, but they tend to be employed in those bigger firms. What we're talking about here, and there's been some positive signs from government in the recent FE white paper, is about technical skills, level 4, level 5 and below. It's about the apprenticeship route, which has been extremely inefficient at producing the numbers, bringing talented people in that will then progress as their career develops and take on those skills as they move forward. And if there is a particular issue we would focus on that is a competitive disadvantage and is stopping some of those things that Lord Sainsbury set out, skills is a real problem. We have been very reliant on the UK and importing those skills from the EU for the last 20 years. That's clearly going to be much, much harder. We shall see after COVID how much of that muscle mass remains, but it's probably going to have reduced. And it certainly is going to be harder to do that quickly and easily, even under the new rules that the Home Office have set out. So we have to do much more domestically. That's going to be an enormous step change in the FE sector and so on. But that, I think, is the single biggest problem. And it's the area where if we want to see rapid change, we have to have rapid investment.
Ben, thank you very much for that. So I think this theme of skills is coming through in the Q&A quite clearly and is a strand that links all of this together. And as you say, Ben, perhaps the area that has if something can be identified and followed through on that could have the greatest impact on our ability to innovate. But Ivana, I noticed you were nodding in violent agreement on those comments, so please.
So I agree with the assessment, especially on the need of on technical skills. The one area I would also add is, from a BEIS perspective, is definitely the adult retraining angle. And a lot of people already in that workforce, for example, lack skills such as digital skills. And there is also a focus in government on improving those. And the final point I would make, especially on STEM skills, your report highlights clearly that probably there isn't so much an issue of supply, but what actually happens to STEM graduates once they enter the workforce. And what we are also finding is that a lot of STEM graduates leave business or don't work in STEM related subjects. So a solution on that has to be in work training and career progression, and we have to be working with business on that. So I think the issue of skills is recognized within government as quite an important area.
That's great. Thank you. Maybe if I can loop back then to Carlos to sort of bring those strands together, because clearly the evidence shows certain things. This is being clearly reinforced from the policy and business and industry side. Anything else you'd like to extract or highlight from the report that either contradicts or agrees with those points?
I think the issue of the importance of industry participation, this is not just about action that needs to be taken by government, but also industry has to be part of the discussion. So all too often the policy debate goes at the very macro level, the macro level figures, and what we see obviously from the report is that the details of the sectors matter, and sometimes we're not on top of these patterns of sectoral performance. So there needs to be a dialogue in industry about how industries are doing, whether they're investing enough in innovation, and that is in what is driving value added in different industries. Again, it is clear that R&D investment is not necessarily translated into value added. There's many issues at play, many international issues, competitiveness issues, and understanding those future viable pockets of industry in the UK, high value adding industries, will require a better understanding, not only the figures, but also of the competitiveness trends in an international perspective and the technology trends that are also reshaping industries. And so, yeah, I guess the first message that we definitely observe is the need for industry to also think this is part of the national conversation that needs to be there and inform policy thinking.
Thanks, Carlos. Eoin, anything you'd care to add on that point, or those 2 points in particular?
I'm slightly worried my signal is very bad. Everybody keeps freezing here. But I think one of the things maybe we haven't really talked about is attention to some of the high value emerging new sectors that somehow aren't in the economic data analysis already. So for example, one of the things you see in some of the pharma trends that Carlos showed earlier are countries maybe specializing in some of the higher value emerging areas. So for example, in the national accounts, areas like advanced therapy, medicinal products, so that's sort of gene therapy and cell therapy and tissue engineering, something we don't actually count in the national economy. And there's some really important trends there, and we need to be tracking those. And I think we need help from industry to diagnose what's going on there. But also I think it links to some of the other comments around skills and workforce development, to make sure that we are conscious of those sectors for all sorts of reasons, to make sure that we have a sort of a workforce development program that is commensurate with the emergence of those new technologies themselves and those new industrial areas themselves. It's very striking when you look at other countries' sort of industrial innovation policy, this attention to, as new sectors emerge, you're growing the technologies and the innovation, but you're also growing the workforce commensurate with that, and you're growing the supply chains commensurate with that. So I think that attention to the emerging areas, and again, the coherence between the sort of traditional research and innovation, the workforce, and the supply chains are key.
And thanks, Eoin. Thanks, Carlos. I guess that point about the coherence between these activities, if effort, it's difficult enough to identify specific areas, or not always difficult, sometimes it's very clear what is missing and what not happening, but how to ensure that this isn't a single point solution for a one-off problem. It's about how does it fit together, particularly linking skills, the technology and the development of new supply chains, or the transformation of existing supply chains. Without that, I guess the risk is that you end up with lots and lots of solutions reflecting lots and lots of data points. So on this issue of coherence, I guess anything, Ben, from your side on that in particular, where you represent a huge number of organizations and you have campaigns that push for very sensibly for very particular things. Do you see this as a concern that we're not necessarily joining things up? I guess in 2 ways. One is reflecting the needs of the smaller companies as well as the larger companies, and making sure that voice between industry and the policymakers is as open as it can be.
Yes, I mean, I think the future of solutions in this debate is definitely about much better collaboration and much better join up. I think it's at an industrial level, it's about finding ways we can distill some of these key messages, some of the lessons and the successful elements, and make them relevant, as I said, to smaller business. I think the join up that we're particularly focused on, and I've not done them a full justice, but just looked at some of the questions in the Q&A, going back to the skills point, is that you know, we've heard from Ivana that the kind of skills message is understood by government, but we don't yet have integrated policies that span the Department of Business, the Department of Education and the Treasury in terms of how we're going to really move those forward. There is still a situation which member companies around the country, every one of the regional meetings we go to really reinforce this, that they can't get into schools to talk about the fantastic career opportunities in manufacturing and engineering, because actually the way that the funding works within the school system means that head teachers don't particularly want to encourage their kids to go off and do manufacturing apprentices, because actually they don't stay on at sixth form and they lose the funding. So you already have a kind of systemic challenge to actually move forward on some of the apprenticeship issues that we talked about and the engagement issues. Now, those things aren't easily resolvable, but they are resolvable if there is a clear and coherent joined up government policy and government thinking. And this is why we're very focused. We've been pushing for this during the week. We've been very focused this week, amplifying a message about really, this is a critical moment, I think, for British industry and the British economy. Like everyone else, we've been through an incredibly challenging year. We've also got these big changes that are being driven by Brexit. What we need is a really coherent plan. We described it as the industrial equivalent of the Marshall Plan yesterday in our press release, just really to emphasize the scale that we think needs to sit behind this. And it is recognizing that if we're not going to simply just say Britain is a service industry economy, we're moving in that direction. If we're going to recognize the strength of manufacturing, we need these different bits of government policy to be tweaked against a single coherent strategy and plan that's quite ambitious in its scope. I really hope that the focus government will have at the end of this year on the COP conference and the fantastic role that British manufacturers could play in that industry and moving us towards net zero will provide the framework for government to bring together those different bits of thinking, fiscal policy, academic and education policy, and industrial policy, and bring them together. Doesn't have to be an enormously long document, but needs to be ambitious in scope. And the final point I would make that, again, I think people often misunderstand or don't appreciate is how much in Britain we have substantial overseas investment in our manufacturers. I was very struck several years ago. I went to a firm in the Northeast that makes septic tanks. It was a fantastic, very successful business, but it made a very, very straightforward and basic product. And it was owned by a French-Canadian conglomerate with a major Japanese shareholder. And one of the really important things, if we want to move forward, is actually the value of these plans in unlocking investment from boards, demonstrating to overseas investors and overseas shareholders that we are really serious about manufacturing in the UK. You know, too many government strategies, and I wrote a few of them in my time as a civil servant, prop up doors. But this stuff isn't just about the value of a glossy document. It's about showing people who have got to make tough investment decisions over the next few years, very tough climate, that actually Britain is serious about manufacturing, serious about these highly skilled jobs. And that's where we will help unleash and release that investment money.
So I think this message of...
Tim,
please.
if I was able to come through, just make one point.
Please.
I think, because I think this point about having a clear view nationally what we're trying to do, these figures are enormously helpful that have been produced in this particular objective. And what BEIS should be doing when it's doing an industrial strategy is working with different sectors, using these figures to have a dialogue with industry, which says, how do we increase the value added of your industry by innovation, and what does that require us to do, and what does that require you to do? And those documents should be based, that kind of thinking should be based on these kind of figures. How do we in pharmaceuticals get back to a position where we have more competitive advantage, we are expanding the industry, we are increasing the value added, and then that can be used to feed through into strategy on skills, R&D, generic technologies, and so on. That's the first point. The second point is just to make a point about skills. I think it should be said that the government has put in place a proper plan for technical level skills. It's called T-levels. It's been rolled out. I'm clearly biased here because I helped the government design it, but it is exactly on the right lines. And industry should be talking much more about this and cooperating with FE colleges to roll out this program, because for the first time, there is a national system of qualifications called T-levels for these areas. The T-levels are designed by people in industry, but part of a national scheme. And this is the way to up the standards and make for more attractive jobs. So industry really now ought to be talking about that in schools and elsewhere and pushing that agenda forward if it wants these highly skilled technicians.
It's very helpful. Thank you for that. So what we've got about 10 minutes remaining. And what we've managed to do so far is to incorporate a number of questions from the audience into issues we've discussed here, which is great. But there remain a number of issues that we've not yet touched upon, and there's no way we can touch on all of these. But before doing that, I just want to give Ivana a chance to respond to what Ben and Lord Sainsbury said there, if that would be helpful, if she wishes to.
I aside from agreement with these points, what I would say is that in the development of any industrial policy, business engagement is very, very key. What I would also say is that it has some of these issues highlighted in the report. Government can make a difference, but I think there is also an important role for business to play in terms of highlighting the skills needs and some of the issues that Ben has just outlined.
That's great. Thank you for that. So again, just breaking it down in my head to avoid this, to give us the structure that will provide something useful for the next round of this report. There are issues about, here is some evidence, what do we do with this to make useful actions? But there's also the issue of, is this the right set of data? What are we missing? What are we not doing? Are the things we've put in this report correct? So a number of questions have come in around this topic of looking at a lot of R&D and this sometimes synonymous use of R&D and innovation. Again, perhaps one for Carlos. Would you care to comment? Because there's a whole bunch of questions related to that I could go through, but perhaps we'll look at those afterwards. But the basic one is R&D, innovation, comments on whether we can be a bit more sophisticated about that.
Yes, thank you. No, that's a great question, I think, Tim. When we started discussing the concept behind this report, it was basically something at the back of our heads. More often than not, innovation reports look at innovation as inputs, activities, and outputs. And outputs of innovation are usually thought of in terms of patents and papers and things like that. And many of these reports are structured around this. But we really wanted to do something different. And we say, well, that is the first level output, but what is the outcome that we want to achieve from innovation investments? And really, ultimately, what we're interested in is the relationship and how innovation and R&D and other innovation activities underpin sectoral performance. So therefore, we put at the heart of this report, I mean, obviously we structure it in different sections, but what is the relationship between sectors and innovation? So we wanted to bring together the value-added data as well, so that we don't lose sight. We might be investing a lot or very much or little in one sector, but how is actually performing in terms of trade, in terms of value added? How does that compare to other countries? So I think we absolutely agree that it's not just R&D that we should be measured. It's not only patents and papers. And as you see this, I think we have taken a different perspective. But so this is the first point. We need to think about value added and how that changes across industries, how the industries are reshaping. And I think as well, we should just not be thinking of innovation in terms of just the new industries and the new and the new companies as well. But many of the new industries will come from the capabilities that exist already in the established industry, the science and engineering capabilities. So I think when we think about the future viable industries in the UK, we'll also need to understand better the capabilities that are embedded already, the science. So in order to take that science, to turn the UK from a science powerhouse into an industry powerhouse as well in the future. So bringing those two types of indicators have been critical for us.
Great, thanks, Carlos. Eoin, would you care to follow up on that?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I mean, I think we're very conscious that some key parts of innovation beyond R&D are not captured. Issues of design and adoption of Industry 4.0 technologies, and there's organizational innovations and so on. And innovation ultimately, as we've talked about a little bit, probably need to talk more about is about ideas getting diffused. I think one of the key messages is that, of course, these are all very different from sector to sector. So if we're going to do this properly, if we're going to look at the importance of design, look at the importance of certain aspects of Industry 4.0, it reinforces this can only really be done sensibly, sector by sector. Otherwise, it all stops making sense if you look at it in aggregation. One of the things, as we spend a lot of time looking at other countries' national innovation reports, is there's an awful lot of very interesting experimentation going on out there, and we should learn from what other countries are doing, often in collaboration with industry associations. So you'll see really interesting surveys in Germany from the German Software Association, really trying to experiment with new ways of gathering insight into other forms of innovation and make sure that it's captured. And you see that feeding into government thinking. So there's a lot to learn, but it does reinforce we need to look at sectors, we need to work with industry. But for sure, if we're really going to understand the process of innovation, we have to go beyond R&D.
So as we are heading towards the end, so we've tried to weave in as many of the audience questions as we can subtly to what people have been discussing, but there remain a bunch of questions about the data and what's being looked at. So just to pre-warn members of the panel, as we head towards it, we'd really like your thoughts on, having now read the report or been involved in the writing of the report, what do you think is still missing? And just before doing that, a few people have been highlighting in the chat about, there are other sources of data, for example, the value-added data from UNIDO. What happens if we look at a different sort of data? Does that actually skew the picture dramatically? Maybe that's, I was going to say a quick one for Carlos to answer. I expect the answer isn't quick. But there's this broader issue of what's missing, and some of the issues around manufacturing versus services, and absolutely understanding where productivity really sits and where value add really sits. So those are things that have been raised by members of the audience. But could I just go around to each person, perhaps starting with Carlos, to give him a chance to answer that value add question, and then to ask each person to say, what's the thing you think we've not gotten this yet? What should we be measuring as well for version 2 of this report? Carlos, starting with you.
There is a very valid question. I think obviously we have the technical information in the report. So technical notes will show where the data comes from. And yes, we looked at different measures of value added that you actually have. Actually, we're thankful for the colleagues at who actually offer some of the data. For example, we triangulated the data on aerospace, which is difficult, and you can look at the product level and the activity level. And yes, I mean, obviously we will welcome the feedback from the audience, but we're quite confident that by looking at different measures of value added, for example, and how you count the value added in different sectors, they were quite, the picture is the same. So it wouldn't affect the message. Now, in terms of the what else is missing, I think really, I mean, I guess in a manufacturing company, what we do is to try to find the 5 whys of why a product is not performing well. So I think this report is only giving you the first why, it's only telling you, well, you don't have an overall performance that you like because the parts of which are the sectors are performing like this. But obviously what we're missing is the next why. So why is that in each industry and why is that after that? So after, I guess that's what you would do in a root cause analysis, and we're just scratching the surface there.
Carlos, thank you. Eoin, your thought on one thing we've not yet got in.
Well, I think probably just need to give the health warning that if we're going to do proper international benchmarking, ultimately that requires things are sort of standardized across nations and so on. So ultimately, this is all about working with the OECD and others to make sure we can do this properly. There are obviously other things we can do, and we can cross-correlate with other types of data sources. I'll give you two, Tim. That's okay. I personally think it's really important that we do look at emerging subsectors, and we're tracking where these high-value things are emerging. And we understand where we're really competing, and do that in terms of skills and R&D and everything else. I think Ivana mentioned regions before. I think it's really important that we're somehow tracking that. It's not going to be easy. I think we lose a lot in aggregation. We don't see what the UK is really competing against. I think there's some really interesting things going on in other countries where the sort of technology R&D intensive regions are interacting with the sort of manufacturing regions, and there's a really mechanisms in place to ensure diffusion of knowledge, which are really important. I'm not sure we've got that right into the context of discussing strength in places and other mechanisms and leveling up. I think we really need data on that. And finally, I suppose it's just as, I think Ben mentioned things like the Made Smarter Northwest pilots, and a lot of those kind of initiatives are regionally based. And I think it's really important to think about those kind of mechanisms in a regional context as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Eoin. Ivana.
I would completely echo what Ian just said. It is about the levels as well as what you measure. So the subsectors and regional angle is extremely important. The other thing I would highlight is the role of other intangibles, and it goes to the point of innovation is not just about R&D. And the reason why we are reporting measurements on R&D is mainly because there are already systems established to measure it. Once you get into other intangibles such as business process or product innovation or organizational structure, then you start going into the level of the firm, and collecting data, which is at times commercially sensitive, is quite difficult. But I think this is key to understanding how innovation diffuses across the economy and across business. So the focus on other intangibles is something worth investing in the future. And final point is that we in government have also started looking at alternative data sources, in particular real-time indicators, vacancies data, and machine learning to really capture what's going on in the economy in real terms. And I completely take the point on standardization and comparability, but we have to probably adopt innovation also in the way we measure and apply indicators.
Great, thank you. Ben, any brief thoughts from you?
I'll keep them very brief. It's an excellent report, so there are no obvious gaps. I think the two things that I would say are really critical are one, the very real world measure of confidence. This is a decision for many firms about a step into the unknown. And I think the ability to measure industrial confidence, give people and make people aware of that challenge in our lobbying is absolutely critical. And I think the second thing is that I said at the beginning, the critical issue for us that I think we have to take from this is about collaboration. And one of the things that would be great to measure is the ability of firms to access the incredible talent and capability in science research and academic institutions. And it will be really interesting to see over the next few months and years whether that expands, takes off, because I think it's fundamental to future success.
Brilliant, thanks, Ben. Before I wrap things up and draw this to a close, Lord Sainsbury, is there anything you'd like to say at this point?
No, I think it is an excellent report. I think, of course, it can be improved, but there's always a danger in these things that people's reaction is, how can we improve the report? whereas the real issue is how can we improve the economy? And I think there's enough in this report to say various people in positions in BEIS and business and elsewhere could go away from this and start saying, look, how do we change this bit of the system? How do we align the skills better? How do we talk to industry in the pharmaceutical industry about how they increase their value added? There's a whole lot of indications here that people should go away and start thinking about and what can be done about it. And that includes not only government, but industry. I mean, there's things in this industry about the performance of particular sectors. And I would think that chief executive and directors in those industries, like the pharmaceutical industry, ought to be asking themselves why they, a highly knowledge-intensive business sector, is losing out so badly internationally. That is the question. There's lots of questions which come out of this that people in industry and government should be asking themselves. Meantime, of course, more work should be done on this report, but that shouldn't be an excuse for not going out and doing some things, because there's some very clear messages in this report about what should be done.
Thank you for that. So what's been, first of all, just a couple of comments. Thank you to all, everybody on this screen at the moment for your contributions and for doing the report. That's absolutely fantastic. And if we can pass on our thanks to the rest of the team, Eoin and Carlos, for the work they've done, absolutely brilliant. Clearly, this is the beginning. This is the start of something, and we want to make that absolutely clear. And what's been fantastic is the level of questions submitted in advance, plus all the questions that have been pouring in. We absolutely want to tap into that, because this is meant to be a co-created thing that is going to lead to useful actions. So we will do our best to respond to all the questions that came in. Some great points raised there. We've covered quite a few of them, but not many as well. If anybody wishes, if it hasn't yet seen the full report is available from the link to this webinar and from the CIIP website. When we end this webinar in a couple of seconds, you'll be directed to a page where there's a short survey for you to provide input there. But it just remains me to say thank you to our speakers, panelists, and the research team, and particularly to the audience for your patience and your input throughout this webinar. Thank you all very much, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you.